Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending the City of Placentia's Calpers Pension Liability Refinancing Workshop. This is an opportunity for the city to get together with our community, even during COVID times, to ensure that we're providing transparent and adequate information about some of the large decisions that the City Council has made with respect to fiscal prudency and fiscal sustainability. I'd now like to introduce our mayor, who will be going through a brief update and introduce our speakers here tonight for this workshop. Mayor Ward Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arula. Good evening, and thank you for participating in our community workshop. Whether it's in person here today, at home, via our cable channel, or online, we appreciate your time in the city's continued efforts to improve its financial position and ensure its fiscal sustainability. Our Finance Director, Jessica Brown, will be providing a presentation on refinancing our pension liability with the Lease revenue bonds. Like many other cities, California cities, the city's pension costs have grown. I feel like I'm too loud here. Have grown over the last decade, leaving the city at the mercy of the California Public Employees Retirement System, also known as PERS. Presently, despite the current economic climate, we have found ourselves in a favorable position to refinance our pension liability by issuing lease revenue bonds. Much like the concept of refinancing your home, the city can refinance its pension liability at interest rates substantially lower than the 7% that CalPERS is charging the city on its liabilities. Once again, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to learn about our efforts to further strengthen the financial position of our city. So thank you, and please enjoy the information. Jessica?
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our CalPERS Pension Liability Refinancing Community Workshop. I'm excited about the opportunity to share some information with all of you and the continued efforts of the City Council and Administration to further strengthen the city's financial outlook. This evening, the workshop is structured to provide an understanding of the city's current pension status, which will demonstrate why a refinancing is beneficial to the city. We'll introduce the financing advisory team, explain the refinancing lease revenue bond structure, which also includes a pension Section 115 trust to address any additional future liabilities. So the CalPERS pension liability, I'm going to go through a little bit of a background to just kind of build that foundation in which the whole concept is built upon. We have the California Public Employee Retirement System. This is CalPERS, and that's how I'll refer to it throughout the presentation, is the largest public retirement system in the state of California. Its membership includes just under 3,000 employers and just over 2 million total members. And like most cities in the state, the city is also a member of CalPERS and participates in the retirement system. As such, the city's retirement plans are managed by CalPERS, and also CalPERS sets the retirement rates. There are 4 different types of members for which the city's retirement plan covers, and they include the active, transferred, separated, and retired participants. Now, the active participants are current employees of the city. Transferred employees are those that worked for the city at one time and have transferred to another CalPERS agency or reciprocal agency. Separated are those that are no longer working for the city or another CalPERS agency. And then, of course, we have our retired population. The city also has 5 different plans, including a miscellaneous, or what we've referred to as a classic plan. These are city employees who were employed with the city before 2013. We also have a miscellaneous or Tier 2 plan. These are city employees that became employed after 2013 and may have been a member of another CalPERS agency prior to 2013. Then we have our safety plan, which is essentially our city police department employees. And then we have two PEPRA plans, plans for miscellaneous and safety employees that became employees with the city after 2013. Now, PEPRA stands for Public Employee Pension Reform Act, and it was enacted into law in 2013. It was due to ever-increasing pension costs. This was an attempt to control those pension costs as they were going, and essentially what it did was increase the retirement age, the eligibility age, as well as reduce the retirement formula for those participants. Now, each plan has a different retirement formula, and as such, the cost differs for each one. PEPRA employees are thus the least expensive of these, all of these plans. Annually, the city's membership will shift between these different plan types. The significance of this is that eventually all of the participants will be in that PEPRA category, that less expensive category. In fact, as illustrated here on this slide, over the past 5 years, the city's cost pool retirement shifted by 54% from the highest cost pool in 2014 to the lowest cost pool that classic, from classic to the PEPRA class pool in 2019. In this last year alone, we've had a shift of 7% from that classic employee to that PEPRA employee. Now, this demonstrates the overall improved path that the city is on with respect to its retirement costs. With respect to the costs that are associated with the city's retirement plans that we just went over, there are many variables that make up the overall retirement liability. Calpers has the responsibility of projecting out what the city's cost will be to provide those retirement benefits in the future. As such, there are many assumptions that are then taken into consideration to derive that cost, such as the retiree life expectancy, inflation, investment returns of the plan, as well as future employee earnings. And those are just to name a few of the assumptions that are taken into consideration. The city's retirement plan has 3 funding components. We have investment earnings, normal cost, and the pension liability payments. Now, the normal cost is going to be the cost that is a fixed percentage based upon the city's payroll for the employees during any fiscal year. Both employees and employers pay a portion of that normal cost. The next cost component we have are investment earnings. Now, Calpers' cost model currently assumes that the annual investment of the members' contributions will make a 7% return. And then lastly, we have the pension liability or the unfunded accrual liability, which we also refer to as UAL, that fund the plan overall. So investment earnings are critical because they make up the majority of the city's retirement plan funding. Currently, Calpers has an assumed 7% return, which has been lowered over the past few years. As demonstrated in the table here, what you can see is we've gone from a 7.5% down to a 7% assumed investment earnings. However, what is critical in this slide is that the actual investment returns have been on a downward trend the last couple of years. It was anticipated that we'd have a 7% return in fiscal year 2019-20. However, we only had a 4.7% return. So based upon that alone, we're essentially going to have a funding shift that's going to occur because we know the funding that we need, and if it's not coming from one source, it's going to have to shift and come from another. So in regards to that shift, I wanted to demonstrate exactly what that looks like for the city. What I've presented here is based upon the assumptions that Calpers has made. Now, we have an assumed investment earnings of 7%. We have that normal cost, which is based upon that percent of payroll, which is fixed, and then we have the pension liability payments. Now, this As indicated, the investment earnings represent the majority of the overall funding, annual funding for the city. As you can see here, it's 64%. And the normal cost, which is the fixed percent, represents 12%. Currently, the pension liability payments are 24%. So then the question begs, what happens when the assumed investment earnings of 7% are not achieved? So essentially what happens, you see that shift in the overall funding of the plan. So what you'll see here is what the actual returns were for 2019-20 of 4.7%. And what you see is a huge shift in that overall formula. The requiring funding amount, because the required funding amount did not change. However, the sources from which the funding is coming from is what is shifted. Now, because the assumed earnings of 74% or 7% were not achieved, the funding component, that funding component only contributed 43% of the required 64%. Now, in order to meet that funding requirement, the city's pension liability payments are increased. And this is exactly how, one way that a pension liability is then created. So during the life of the city's retirement plan, there have been various assumptions that have been made, like the 7% return on investments. There are other assumptions such as life expectancy. Members are living longer than they were before, therefore there's going to be a benefit that needs to be paid out longer than originally anticipated. Payroll increases occur, inflation occurs. So when the funding model doesn't produce the funds necessary that are projected to be needed, the difference is then referred to what we call that unfunded accrued liability, or as we're addressing it here tonight, the pension liability. What I think is important here is to see the difference between in the funding shift that actually occurs. So in the assumed pie chart that you see up here, again, shows that in a perfect world, if all the assumptions had remained in place, then the funding would have actually met all of the required percentages. Now the actuals here, you see that shift from the pension liability payments going from 24% shifting to 45% of the annual cost to the city because of the fact that the return on investments did not actually materialize. This is another critical table, I believe, in to fully understanding what is going on with the city's pension costs. This table shows the historic growth of the city's pension liability over the last 5 fiscal years. The assumed columns, here we have the pension liability balance and the payments, and these were projected and reported out to the city as of August 2016. Again, those 5 years assume that all of the projections and all the assumptions remained in place, that the pool earned a 7% return, that there were no changes in any other assumptions. At the end of that, from 2017-18, we had a reported UAL balance or pension liability of $31.7 million. And then it was projected to actually decrease in 2020-21 to $31.1 million. This is based upon, again, it earning and the plan being funded every single fiscal year. It also includes the fact that the city would have been making their UAL payments on an annual basis, thus decreasing that, essentially that principal balance. The columns to the right are the actual results of where we're at now. We have actually, you can see here the very far column, we have an increase in overall pension liability. And that very far column shows you what the variance is between what was originally assumed and what actually materialized. So at the end of it, we're projecting a total UAL or a pension liability balance of $48 million at the end of this fiscal year. That's nearly 55% higher than what Calpers had projected merely 5 years ago. So this is the direct result of not achieving those investment earnings, of the assumed interest being lowered, which it has happened over the course of the last 5 years, as well as other actuarial assumptions, changes that Calpers has put into place, such as life expectancy. This last chart here is basically showing the city's current pension liability, and it illustrates the annual increase in those pension liability payments. So currently, for this fiscal year, our pension liability payments are in the amount of $2.9 million, and they're increasing to $5.1 million in the next 10 years, or in fiscal year 2031-32. All of it is essentially being financed by Calpers at 7%. This is exactly why we are here tonight. The city's pension liability is its largest liability, and as part of our fiduciary responsibility to city residents, the proposed pension liability refinancing plan that we have assembled ensures that the city is managing its liability and in the best interest of its taxpayers. So upon approval from City Council to move forward with the pension liability refinancing, the financing advisory team was then assembled. So just briefly, I just would like to let the public know who is on our advisory team. We have Mr. Robert Torres. He is the city's financial consultant. We have Cosmont, Harrell and Company Advisors. Both are co-advising on this bond deal. We also have Nixon Peabody and Stifel as our underwriter. So collectively, the financing advisory team has over 174 years of experience. We've participated in over 1,275 public financings. So with that, and providing you a solid foundation as to why we're here and what we'd like to discuss with you tonight, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Robert Torres, the city's finance consultant, who will then walk you through the proposed structure of the pension liability refinancing. And then we will go through the final plan itself and make ourselves available for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the bond structure that is being proposed. So if you just think about this as pretty similar to refinancing your mortgage to take advantage of lower rates. If you're paying 5% on a mortgage and today's rates are 3%, why wouldn't you want to take advantage of that? So that's what we're kind of talking about here. So this, see, we're out here on the slides. Okay, so why refinance the pension liability? In order to take advantage of lower interest rates. Interest rates are at near historic lows. They hit historic lows back in August. They've increased a little bit, but they're still very low. And they're a lot lower than the 7% that Calpers is charging the city on its $48 million liability. So $48 million, Calpers is charging 7%, whereas if the city were to refinance this existing debt, the interest rates would be between 4 and 5%. It would result in a more manageable payment for the city. Right now, the Calpers annual payments are escalating, and they let us know 2 years in advance what we're going to be paying 2 years from now, but we don't know how high it's going to go in 3 and 4 and 5 years. And the budget savings allow the city to more efficiently budget its resources, because we'll know, the city will know going forward what its annual payments are going to be on the pension bonds. So this next slide, I'm going to describe what lease revenue bonds are. So there's two ways to finance pension liabilities. The one way is called a pension obligation bond. It's kind of a long process. It requires a court validation. We'd have to file a validation action with the court. The court would take 3 to 5 months or longer, because in the pandemic era today, we don't know how long it would take for a court to review the city's bond proposal. In addition, in recent months, outside groups have posed or discussed publicly, perhaps challenging the ability of cities to issue pension bonds, even though pension bonds have been issued for every year for the last 30 years. I issued my first set of pension bonds back in 1994. And every time there's been a pension bond proposed it's been validated, but not by the court. But nonetheless, there's outside groups that are threatening to mount a court challenge. So the other alternative, which we suggest is more efficient and much speedier, are called lease revenue bonds. So under California law, cities cannot issue debt without voter approval. However, under California law, cities may enter into leases. So the structure we're talking about sounds a little complicated, but it's basically a lease structure. The city would pledge city assets, to the city's public financing authority. The financing authority would lease those assets and in turn use those in order to issue bonds backed by the pledge of the city assets. The public financing authority would issue the bonds and lease the assets back to the city. It's called the leaseback, and the city would make lease payments to the public financing authority. The authority would take those lease payments and make the bond payments. So this is a widely accepted structure of financing, lease revenue bonds. It's been used for decades by California cities to finance their various needs. More recently, the cities West Covina, Torrance, El Monte, Fairfax, and Ridgecrest have issued or are planning to issue lease revenue pension bond, same as we're proposing to issue now. The pension obligation bonds would probably obtain a BBB rating, and the rating on the lease revenue bond may be a tick below that, but our financing team, including the underwriter Stiefel, feels very confident that there's a lot more interest by investors in the lease revenue bond structure because of the pledge of assets. Therefore, even though the interest rates, even though the credit rating might be a little bit lower issuing lease revenue bonds, the interest rates might be lower than if the city were to issue pension obligation bonds. So the characteristics of the lease revenue bond structure, I've already mentioned. The city would pledge non-essential assets. If the city does not make lease payments to its public financing authority, the trustee is authorized to relet the property. However, that's never happened in the history of lease revenue bonds. Their only recourse really for investors would be to mount a court challenge against the city. The investors would go to the trustee would contact the city and request that the city make good on its payment. As part of the structure, the lease revenue bonds will include what's called a debt service reserve fund. So 1 year's worth of bond payment would be set aside in a reserve fund in the event that for whatever reason the city's not able to make a bond payment. So the first action that would take place is that bond reserve would be used in the event the city, for whatever reason, cannot make its bond payment. However, the city's never missed a bond payment, so I don't think there's anything really to worry about that. Lease payments must represent the fair market value of the assets. They must be subject to annual appropriation, which means that the city annually in its budget must include a line item to pay the lease payment to the public financing authority, and the authority in turn has to have a line item budget to make the bond payment, subject to appropriation. And then the last thing on this structure, lease revenue bonds, is that they're subject to abatement. So what that means is that for the pledged assets, if there's an event such as, let's say, a flood or an earthquake that makes the property unusable, for that portion of time that the property must be reconstructed, there's no bond payment required on that portion. That's called an abatement of lease. So here is a graph that shows the mechanics of the lease revenue bond structure. As I mentioned earlier, the city of Placentia would lease assets to the Placentia Public Financing Authority. The authority would make a nominal payment to the city. The authority, in turn, would use the pledged assets in order to back a bond issue. In this case, a bond issue would be to pay off the unfunded liability that Jessica talked about earlier. And then in return, the bonds would flow to the trustee, and the trustee would make the payment of the unfunded liability to Calpers, immediately wiping out the current unfunded liability. And the city would go from having to pay 7% on the unfunded liability to pay whatever the bond rate is. And again, it would be somewhere, we feel pretty confident, it would be somewhere between 4 and 5 The city in turn would make the annual lease payment to the Public Financing Authority, and the authority would use those funds to make the bond payment. So here's a list of potential assets. The team, along with the city administrator and other city staff, are still reviewing this list to select the assets that make the most sense. They would have to equal the amount of the par amount of the bonds. And one thing to consider as well is that once the city issues the bonds in the future, it would have the ability to refinance that debt. And at that time, it could remove some of these assets from the pledges. So this table right here compares the annual cost over the next 25 years of making the unfunded liability payments to Calpers. That cost would be about almost $85 million, whereas if the city issued lease revenue bonds, the payments would come out to approximately $75.5 million for a savings of $9 million. The debt service reserve fund, that reserve that's set aside to make 1 year's payment, would in fact be used to make the final payment. So when you add that back to the mix, that increases the savings to over $13 million. And in addition, Jessica, our finance director, has received an estimate from Calpers of what next fiscal year's unfunded liability increment is going to be, and we're proposing to roll that into the financing. That would save an additional $1.8 million. So over the next 25 years, the savings to the city would be significant. It would be in excess of $15 million. And to put it in, I think, a better perspective, is the savings over time would average, it'll vary from year to year, but it'll average about $600,000 a year. That is savings that can be used by the city for a lot of purposes. It can be put in reserve, it can be spent on infrastructure, et cetera. So the next slide, well, I think that kind of does it for me. Oh, I got one more slide. Okay, this one is just to show you that, I've mentioned that rates would be somewhere between 4% and 5%. So market rates change daily. It depends on how the stock market does and the bond market. In the last few weeks, rates have stood pretty stable. They've been pretty stable. And I just checked the market report before I came here today, and there has been no change. So the rates are still pretty low, and they're very attractive. But if interest rates were to go to increase by 0.25%, so you see on the right on this graph, on this chart, 0.25 basis points. Well, that means 0.25%. So if interest rates went up by 0.25%, that would reduce the overall savings from 13 million. It would reduce it by a couple of $1 million. So it depends on how interest rates go. If you get an incremental increase in interest rates, savings will go down. If you get an incremental decrease in interest rates, savings will increase. So we're watching the market very carefully, and we'll put everything together, bring all the documents to City Council for approval, and then hopefully interest rates will be attractive on the day we propose to sell. Jessica will talk about that in a minute. And that kind of wraps it up for me. I'm going to turn it back to Jessica to complete the presentation. Thank you very much.
Robert. So as we've discussed up until now, there's a couple different components we're putting a comprehensive plan together. We have changes that Calpers has made to kind of stabilize their plan overall and to improve the financial outlook of it. We had PEPRA that was implemented back in 2013 that made our employees or the future employees a less expensive workforce. The refinance option is going to save the city millions of dollars. And the final piece that kind of pulls all of that together is the proposed PARS Pension Section 115 Trust. The trust is also referred to as a pension rate stabilization, and that in and of itself is exactly what it's designed to do. The 115 Trust will be established at the council meeting at the end of October, and this will be the final piece that's going to make this a comprehensive, complete refinancing model for the city. The purpose of the trust is to set aside funds for future pension costs. It's basically prepaying future pension costs. As demonstrated earlier, the city's pension plan is subject to future pension liability in the event that Calpers plan does not perform the way as they anticipate it to. Based upon that, the 115 trust would be used to mitigate any future costs and will be funded through the cost savings that the city will realize through the refinancing. So one important piece of this refinancing model is that even though we're refinancing the existing liability, there is the potential of future liabilities to be created in the event that the funding model for the CalPERS retirement plan does not materialize. So a few things in regards to the trust itself. We have why should we use it? Why should we go through the process of establishing a trust? It basically sets the funds aside, makes them available to the city. It provides a plan in the event that the market completely fails the CalPERS plan altogether. Additionally, allows the funds to be placed into a trust where there's the ability, the potential to make a significant more amount of returns than we would if we had kept those funds in the city's traditional accounts. This particular slide here shows the potential portfolio returns. The returns themselves, as you can see over the course of time, have a really good return as compared to the returns that are traditionally received and the city has kept their funds in, particularly life. CDs are around, give or take 1% at this time. So there is the ability to see a significant increase in returns if we use this particular vehicle to set those funds aside. This slide here then again shows the returns that in the event that we take savings from the refinancing and the amounts of $250,000 a year and put them into the trust. This slide here shows what exactly those returns will look like, and it's well over $3 million over the course of 10 years and should be more than adequate to help mitigate any future liability costs that the city may be facing. And again, this is that comprehensive model that I was talking about. We're doing the refinancing. We set aside the 115 trust to prepare for the future. We're taking care of our current immediate liability, but we're also preparing and planning for that potential future liability. The comprehensive plan itself really just prepares the city to have an increase in their financial outlook and just makes it that much more secure. So the next steps with respect to the financing itself, this week we are finalizing all of the necessary bond documents to move forward. We have the council consideration the week of October 19th for all of the bond documents, and of course we have the bond sale and bond closing. As Robert had mentioned, the city does have the ability to, at the point in time that we go to sell, if the rates are not favorable, we can hold off until they do become more favorable. We're not completely locked in, but in the position to make the best possible decision for the city and its finances. So that concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, we'd be more than happy to address them. If you're not here this evening, please do reach out to me directly. My email address has been provided, or do give me a call. I'll be more than happy to address them. Copies of the PowerPoint are also online, as well as frequently asked questions. We will make those available as well. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all for your attendance and look forward to moving forward with this bond refinancing. Thank you.